The best sources for Jesus are, without a doubt, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are early Christian documents found at the beginning of what we now call the New Testament. There are great debates as to whether they go back to much earlier sources and as to when they themselves were written. Some scholars date some or all of them as early as the early 60s AD, or even in some cases back into the 50s. Most scholars would say that they date from somewhere between the mid 60s to somewhere between in the mid 80s. And that's pretty much like books about Winston Churchill written 40 or 50 years after his life, when people had had time to sit back and think, just what was that all about, etc. So it's quite close up. And the great thing about those narratives is that they are very vivid. They are probably more vivid as a portrayal of their central character than anywhere else in all literature, ancient or modern, with two interesting exceptions: Plato's picture of Socrates, and then, curiously, in the 18th century English world, Boswell's picture of Samuel Johnson, where you get the sense of this is how the man actually talked. This is what it felt like being with him. Now, many people have said we can't trust those. Some people have said Jesus was a fiction of the early Christian imagination, but he does crop up in other sources as well. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the last third of the century, talks about Jesus in a quizzical sort of fashion of, well, he was a very strange man, and one would have thought his cause would be finished, but some of his tribe are still around. And the Roman historian Tacitus mentions him as well, again, writing a bit later, but clearly knowing about not only the movement of Jesus' followers, who by then were called Christiani, the Messiah people, but also a bit about Jesus himself. And Jesus crops up in some of the much later Jewish sources, where Jesus to this day is remembered by Jewish people, in some cases as a dangerous person who led Israel astray, in other cases rather wistfully as, oh, he was just one of the greatest Jewish teachers, and what a pity it all went horribly wrong. But we come back and we say, well, those outlying sources are interesting, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the writings in Acts and what Paul says about Jesus, writing in the 50s particularly, these are our best sources for who he was and what he said and did and what he achieved.